Hello and welcome to the UK column. I am joined today once again by Carl Za. Welcome to the program, Carl. This is going to be the second in our discussions about China. And after the last time we spoke, I said to you, well, my first question in the next discussion is going to be, is China still a communist country? So let's start there. Is China still a communist country?
Mike, that's such a broad question because even people in the West have very different definition what communist is. I mean, back in the U.S., there's some the on the Republican side they think Joe Biden is a communist or Kamala Harris is communist. But China is a country that's ruled by the Communist Party of China. But we got to pay attention to what they say about their country. So according to the Communist Party of China, currently they're building the initial stage of socialism. So they're not there yet. They're not communism. They're not even at socialism. They're building the initial stage of socialism. That's how they describe their own country and their society. What I would say is today it's far easier to start and operate a business in China than in United States. I mean, this is even true for foreign entrepreneurs who have business in China. And China obviously welcome foreign businesses. We have seen CEOs, American CEOs like Tim Cook, Elon Musk, visiting China and welcome with open arms. Now, some people say, well, okay, China is just as capitalist as United States, but there's actually a bit difference because in U.S. the money runs politics. Big money runs the politics. We have seen that with our latest election. We have people like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, all the big Silicon Valley venture capitalists. They are a big force in getting Trump elected, and they wield enormous influence in U.S. We saw people like Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg attending the presidential inauguration, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas in China, you can become a billionaire. There are many Chinese billionaires nowadays, but they don't get to set political agenda. So, for example, back when during Obama's administration, Obama approached then Apple CEO Steve Jobs, and he said, "Steve, can we build more iPhones or Apple products in United States?" And Steve Jobs told Obama, "No, it's not possible because there's not enough skilled worker in U.S." Here you have Obama, the supposedly the most powerful man in the world, the leader of the free world, approaching a business leader, asking him to source more locally inside United States. And Steve Jobs basically gave him a big fat fu and said, "No, it's not possible." Now, Jack Ma, who is a billionaire in China, he would not be able to do that to Xi Jinping. If Xi Jinping ever call up Jack Ma and say, "Hey, Jack, can we make sure Alibaba source more of the products from China?" Jack Ma will not be able to tell Xi Jinping, "No, we're not going to do that. We're going to seek to maximize our profit." This is the difference between China and United States. In U.S., the political system has been totally captured by big money, by the Wall Street, by the Silicon Valley VCs. In China, you can get rich, you can be a billionaire, but you don't get to set policy. You don't get to set agenda. Jack Ma does not get to set agenda of China. They are welcome to operate their business to become billionaires, but they don't get to change policy. They don't, it's not like Washington. You can, where U.S. have the best congressman money can buy. In China, it's still the Communist Party of China that's running things, not big businessmen like Jack Ma or the founder of Tencent or any of that. So I think that's a major difference, because but China do have a market economy. This was decide deliberately a policy set down in the Deng Xiaoping era when Deng Xiaoping said who says only the capitalist country can have market economies? And Deng Xiaoping actually said, socialism is not about poverty. If we cannot provide our people with prosperous lives, then our socialism would have failed. Because socialism is not to be poor. And then then there's another school of thought within China. So another elder statesman Chen Yun, who worked alongside Deng Xiaoping, he said, "What we need to put certain restriction around capital." He used an analogy of a bird in a cage. He said, we need market economy, but we can't have the market run everything. So this is why like the market is like a bird that you put in a cage. Um, we just get to decide how big the cage is, but if there's no cage, the bird will fly away. We cannot have rampant capitalism where the big money dominate everything. So we got to put restriction around it. But the cage cannot be too small, because that will suffocate the bird. That will choke off the market economy. That's not good. We need to give it room. We need to give room for the market economy to grow, but ultimately we still need to put restriction around it. This is called the birdcage economy model in China, and this pretty much how it has been operated since 1980s. Where private business is allowed, where people are allowed to accrue wealth and even become billionaires, but they're not allowed to take over the government. Big money billionaire were not allowed to take over the government.
Obviously, it's clear in the United States what the motivation is for somebody to go into politics, because, as you say, it's the best politicians that money can buy. And the motivation is clear. So in China, then we have a Communist Party of China with a leadership and a hierarchy. But at the same time, we have people operating in this birdcage economy with the potential to become billionaires. What drives and motivates people to join into the political system rather than the world of commerce?
That's a great question, because in United States, which many people are familiar with, the way to make money is join the Wall Street, right? That's because U.S. economy has been so financialized. That's where you make the big money. That's why there's a lot of smart people in U.S., but many of them are incentivized to join the financial industry because that's where the money is. And whereas in China, join government is still a very sought after career path. I mean, China have 1,000 years of history, and China had 1,000-year-old centralized bureaucracy, Confucianist bureaucracy. You can think of the Communist Party of China today as kind of inheritor of that 2,000-year-old tradition, of that 2,000-year-old Confucianist bureaucracy. But instead of calling itself Confucian now, it's calling itself Communist Party of China. I mean, obviously they have incorporated a lot of concept, from Marxism, but there's actually a show, a TV show recently in China. They had it's called Confucius Meets Marx, and they have a guy dressed as Marx, and he said, "Well, I have been living in China for over 100 years now, and by now I'm basically Chinese." So in a way, the Chinese, they took foreign concept like Marxism, and they indigenized it, they Sinicized it and made it Chinese. They incorporated Confucianism combined with, you know, Confucianism, because Confucianism is really about a governing ideology. One way to think about it is the Communist Party of China today is like the old Confucianist bureaucracy got a software update. They got a software update with an injection of a little bit Marxism, socialism precept. But for a lot of people, especially young people, I grew up in China, as I mentioned before. I spent most of a decade of the 1980s in China. The government, they tend to they come to the school to recruit like they go to colleges, they will target the top 1% of the people of the class, and they will try to recruit them into the Communist Party. So their goal is to grab the elite, what they call, elite human capital, and get them to join the government. Of course, there are many perks to be a government official. Power, for many people, it's power, is a connection. And I would even say that many people join the Communist Party of China for career advancement. I'm sure there's some people who are doing it for ideology, but I think for majority of the people who joined up, they're doing it for their career advancement. They see a good career ahead of them in government, if that makes sense.
And I guess it's never possible to find out exactly, but I wonder how, for example, the salary of Xi Jinping compares to the salary of a significant businessman. Maybe it's not about salary. Maybe there are other benefits to being the premier of the country. Maybe he doesn't have to worry about anything financial at all. How do we get an idea of what it is like to be a senior CCP member?
This is goes in and out of the government. They usually have an official income, and then they have like income off the books. It's it comes with the perks of the job. For example, when you are a government official, you get a lot of perks. Obviously, in the old days, in the 1980s, when at the time when private car was almost unheard of. If you're a government official, you get provided with a car. You have government provided housing, etc. Of course, now everybody can go can go afford a car. It's with the Chinese EVs, a more ever increasingly more popular. Being a government official, especially higher in the ranks, you have special perks outside of what your official salary states. The people, for example, they have for the top leadership in Beijing, their food is catered to, right? They have special people set aside to grow food for them, organic food, etc. And so there are a lot of perks to the government job. For example, one thing to think about is, one thing China actually study is a Singapore model. The one way the Singaporean government try to recruit, the elite into, the elite capital into its own government, is to provide high salary. This was done in Singapore and in Hong Kong. It's also to stamp out corruption. But China, I think it's a combination of prestige and the perks of the, just have enjoy the perks of the job. I mean, people like Xi Jinping, they really don't need to worry about material needs. And similarly, people of similar ranking in the leadership, they have power. With power, it comes a lot of perks.
Is there any real political opposition in China? Is there any kind of discussion amongst people about what is the right way forward, or is it absolutely 100% controlled by the party hierarchy?
This is a great question. In China, um, investor Eric Lee once famously made a remark. He said, "In United States, you can change the party through election, but you don't change the policy. The deep state will keep running things. In China, you cannot change the government. You cannot change the ruling party, because it's always going to be the Communist Party of China. But you can change the policy, because within the umbrella of the Communist Party of China, there's actually a lot of factions, a lot of different opinions on how to run things. So there's a great diversity of opinions within the Communist Party itself, on how to accomplish a certain task and how to run the country. So, and these different factions, of course, they compete with each other. This is why we see, sometimes we will see China change policy almost like 180 degrees, like the zero COVID. China pursued zero COVID policy for a couple of years, and then suddenly like overnight they just got rid of it because obviously they realized that that no longer works. It's no longer feasible to pursue that policy. So a lot of people get caught in the whiplash, but this is because there's actual um, a dissension among there's actual difference of opinions within the party itself. But it just depends on which faction is more dominant at any moment. But this is how things are done. The there's no I don't think there's real opposition outside of the Communist Party of China. There are other political parties in China, of course, but they are nowhere near as powerful, of course, as the Communist Party of China. And so a lot of the real discussion among how to implement things, how to implement policy, and how to change policy within the party itself. I think the closest analogy people can think about is Japan. You know, Japan had basically one party system since World War II. They had LDP, but within LDP itself, there are many different factions of LDPs competing for power. Um, I think this is probably the closest model to China. China have the Communist Party of China, but within the Communist Party of China, there are different ideas of how to run things, and depending on who is in charge, that get manifested different.
Okay, but you're talking about smaller opposition parties. Do they remain smaller because they don't get the coverage in the media, or do they remain smaller because they're actually oppressed by the state?
A lot of these parties they just don't get um, very popular. I think by the fact that many people recognize, you know, it's like what's the point? They don't have nearly as much power as the Communist Party of China. These parties that are invited to join the political process are part of the political consultation council. Its members sometimes serve in the Congress of People, but these parties have nowhere near the reach or the influence of the Communist Party of China. So if you're top college grads, if only reason for you not to choose one of those parties versus the Communist Party of China is maybe you have some deep held ideological conviction that make you choose one of this party over the Communist Party of China. Because otherwise, like I said, many people actually join the Communist Party of China for their own career advancement rather than ideological reasons.
If we stay on internal Chinese issues, first of all, the real so-called human rights issue that the West likes to beat China over the head with is Xinjiang and the Uyghur situation. Now, you are deeply into Chinese history, and I suppose where I'd like to begin with this is maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the sort of diversity of peoples within China, because people talk about China and they think about China, but just how many people is it now? Is it 1.5 billion yet? It is a huge population, and of course you're going to have diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, but in this case, diversity of religion. How has this problem developed over the years and over the decades and maybe over the centuries?
Right. I mean, of course, China is not. It never claimed to be a ethno state. China in its official charter, it says it's a multi-ethnic country, and it has 56 officially recognized ethnicities. It's including, like, for example, Uyghur in Xinjiang, Tibetans, Mongols, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, of this, the majority, over like 90%, is what they call the ethnic Han, which consists of the majority of the country, and then there's the less than 10%, which what's the so-called national minorities. But these national minority actually live in areas where, like, in they're actually composed of local majority. For example, in Xinjiang, the Uyghur population is about 45%, more than 45% of the population. So they're actually majority in their home region. And China grew out of like ancient empires. This is why China has always been a diverse place. And I just want to say something about the human rights issues, because ever since I moved to the West, to the U.S. in particular, in 1990, only thing I read in mainstream media is how China's human rights issue is deteriorating year after year, and I find it completely bewildering. Like, it's getting worse compared to what? I mean, it's getting worse compared to Mao years, compared to Cultural Revolution. I mean, it does not compute, because when I lived in China in 1980, my experience has been every year is getting better and better, and things are actually opening up more and more. There's more personal freedom in 1990s compared to the 80s, and in 2000 compared to the 90s, and now much more so, um, today in 2025 than, say, in the 2000s. So my experience is that China has been gradually improving, um, you know including on the human rights or issues. And one thing it did so is, by lifting over 800 million people out of poverty. I mean, talking about, speaking of human rights, this basic rights to live a dignified life, and there's not much dignity in poverty. One thing the Chinese government did very successfully in the past decades is lift 800 million people. That's not a small number, out of absolute poverty. They did that by building infrastructure, by pouring investment into poor regions. This is where you see a lot of Western economists question, why would the Chinese government build invest billions into build like high speed rail into outside of the more prosperous coastal regions, like Beijing, Shanghai, because they say, okay, it makes sense to connect the high-speed rail line between Beijing and Shanghai because they're populous region, it's profitable. But why would you build high-speed rail to inland area where it's less profitable? Well, the whole deal is not about making profit, but lifting people out of poverty, and bring more economic prosperity, to spread it from the more prosperous coastal regions to more inland areas. And the Chinese government has done very well in that aspect. And this is where I think, in terms of improvement in human rights, I mean, lifting 800 million people out of poverty, that's a major improvement in human rights, in my opinion.
Okay, but the Uyghur situation itself has come with it a lot of narratives in the West, in particular, about people being sent to so called re education camps and the oppression of a Muslim minority. And this is a West which, at the same time, is oppressing a Muslim minority in Gaza and the West Bank, and is determined to try to oppress another Muslim country in Iran and so on. So we are quite happy to say Muslims bad in this scenario, but Muslims good in this scenario when it suits us politically. So I am very keen to try to understand the facts about Xinjiang and the Uyghur population there and what is actually going on. And this is something that I think is extremely hard to get, perhaps from either the Western media and Western governments, or even perhaps from the Chinese. So I wonder if you've got any sort of relatively independent insight into that.
A lot of the talking points in the West, they talk like, U.S. really care about Muslims, which is ridiculous. U.S. have been bombing Muslim populations for more than 20 years now. And what's happening in Xinjiang was that Xinjiang it is a special region in the northwestern part of China. It's called the full name is Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So in the autonomous regions, by Chinese constitution, the people living in the autonomous regions are entitled to be educated in their own language. So, for example, for the longest time, if you are Uyghur born in Xinjiang, you could be educated entirely in Uyghur language from kindergarten to college without be able to speak a word of Mandarin Chinese. In 1979, this is as the aftermath of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. U.S. This was one of the largest CIA project to counter the Soviet in Afghanistan. This was Operation Cyclone. CIA and also Saudis, they built a whole slew of madrasas, religious schools along Pakistan Afghanistan border to radicalize a lot of those Afghan refugees and their children, to indoctrinate them against the Soviets, and this to be able to support the Afghan Mujahideens against the Soviet invasion. And in 1979 was also the time when China itself opened up. It built a road called the Karakoram highway connecting Xinjiang and Pakistan. So many young Uyghurs, they traveled to Pakistan to work, to study. Some of them drifted to the borders between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And some of them went to this madrasa school, got radicalized, went to Afghanistan to join the Mujahideens. And then in 1990, as the war in Afghanistan was drawn, after the Soviet withdrawal and Afghanistan basically fell into its own civil war, some of these Uyghur Mujahideen start to filter back into China, back into Xinjiang. And this is where a lot of the terrorism incidents start happening. Starting from 1990s, 2000, but it really intensified around 2000. There was a big incident in 2009. At that time, the Chinese government, they thought the way to eradicate terrorism is through improving the economy. Because it's on their Marxist understanding, everything is about the economy. To eradicate the soil for terrorism, they wanted to develop the economy, but there wasn't a lot of private investment going to Xinjiang at that time. So they organized young Uyghur men and women to go work in coastal factories in coastal China, in one of those export factories that make clothes, cars, and toys to export to the West. And whereas the Chinese government will give tax incentives to any private enterprise that would hire these Uyghur workers. And then in 2009, this was in the midst of the great financial crisis. A lot of the export to the West suddenly got stopped. A lot of orders stopped coming because there was a big financial crisis in the United States that was triggered by subprime prime loans, etc. And a lot of people were thrown out of work, and there was but because the Uyghur worker program was sponsored by the government, so a lot of these Uyghur workers will still have their jobs. And at that time, there was an internet rumor going around spread by one of those laid off workers in Guangzhou, in Guangdong. They claimed that a local Chinese girl, Han Chinese girl, went to the dormitory to look for her boyfriend, but she mistakenly went to the Uyghur uh, men's dormitories. So in Chinese factories, they usually build workers' dormitory to host these migrant workers who live basically on site and work on site. And so they claim that she was gang raped, and that they claim that the Chinese government is trying to keep it hush hush, trying to silence this issue, so people don't, end up criticizing their policy. This internet I saw this happen in 2009. The rumor spreading online, and that the result was a over 1,000 plus strong mob stormed the Uyghur workers' dormitory in Dongguan in Guangdong, and in the ensuing fight, couple young Uyghur workers were killed. So this resulted in a big protest back home in Xinjiang, in the capital of Xinjiang, Urumqi, where people are demanding the government to investigate. And the government did investigate, and they actually arrested the 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 laid off worker who was spreading the internet rumor online. He was arrested, but at the same time, a lot of the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy sponsored Uyghur diaspora groups. They were spreading rumors on the internet using like US dominated social media platform like Twitter, like Facebook. And they are telling the people back home in Xinjiang that there was a lot of the young Uyghur women were being gang raped. They were being brutally killed in those factories, and so this really riled up people back home. So the protests grow more intense in the capital Xinjiang Urumqi. This around this, and then the protest went out of control. It turned into an ethnic riot. So Urumqi is the capital of Xinjiang, but it's actually has always been like more Han dominated city. It's about the divide was about 75% Han and then 25% Uyghur. But the protest that took place, it took place near the Uyghur neighborhood, but the Uyghur neighborhood is where a lot of the bus route of the people workers who took at that time 2009. Not many people still have a private car, so a lot of people take buses to leave and come to work, and the bus route goes through the neighborhood, and this was around the rush hour, so the mobs went to stop the buses, or drag people out of the buses and beat them, and many of them beat them to death. So in July 5th, 2009, this happened in Urumqi. Over 200 people were killed in the ethnic rioting, and over 2,000 people were injured. So this sparked the big security crackdown in Xinjiang. And after that, there was, this was when security was greatly increased in Xinjiang. A lot of public places in Xinjiang you go. I'm not sure how true it's today, but back then there was security. Security was very tight. Everywhere you have police checkpoint, security checkpoint. As a result of this Urumqi riot, again, there has always been the element of the extremists, the radicals who are fomenting separatism and terrorism in Xinjiang even before 2009. But after that, um, there was more incident of terrorist attack in Xinjiang, and one of the more serious one was one a group of Uyghurs, they drove a van into Tiananmen Square in Beijing, and they tried to run people over in Tiananmen Square, and then they lit um, uh, the van on fire, trying to explode it in the midst of the Tiananmen Square, and then on March 2014. So this is also coincide at the time of the Syrian war. When ISIS was gaining prominence, and a lot of a lot of Uyghurs would radicalize Uyghurs. They will try to leave Xinjiang and go to Syria. And because the border around Xinjiang was under lockdown, they couldn't go to Pakistan or the Central Asia anymore. They would travel internally within China. Now they can hop on a high-speed train, and then few hours later, they will end up in southwest China, where the border with Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam are a lot more porous. And these Uyghurs will try to leave China uh, through these countries, and this is where U.S. and NATO was. Again, this is the largest CIA operation after Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan. This is Operation Timber Sycamore. This is a CIA sponsored regime change in Syria, when CIA had a rat line flying the jihadists all over the world to Syria to try to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. And and at that time, Turkey was working with NATO and United States, and the Turkish consulate in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, they would hand over Turkish passport to any Uyghurs who made it to their consulate, and that Turkish passport would allow these Uyghurs who claim refugee status to fly to Turkey. Right after they get off their plane at Istanbul airport, they will be greeted by jihadist recruiters who will get them on buses to go to Syria. And this is how Syria, northwest Syria in the Idlib region, now they have some estimated of like 10, anywhere from 10 to 20,000 Uyghurs, um, fighters and their families living there now. And they're still there. And this China started cracking down when they realized this problem. They start to block off the border, um, with Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar around that time. And for people who do Google search, you can find some border incident between with Uyghur refugees with in Vietnam, where some of them shot up some Vietnamese border guard. They grabbed the guns from Vietnamese border guard and shot up some Vietnamese border guard. And there was a diplomatic tussle up also between United States and China on status of some of these detained Uyghurs leaving China. For example, Cambodia was trying to repatriate some of these Uyghurs back to China, and U.S. really brought its diplomatic pressure onto Cambodia and brought more sanction on Cambodia for that, and similarly on Thailand. And in the end, the Thai authority they did a Solomon's justice. They decided, you know what, the Uyghur men they get repatriated back to China, and the Uyghur women they can go to Turkey, and that decision angers some of these Uyghur radicals. That's why they carry out the Bangkok bombing. I think this was 2015. Bangkok bombing by a bunch of Uyghur radicals, and that's when they got found out for for stashes of quote unquote fake Turkish passports. And these Uyghur jihadists would turn up around all over Southeast Asia, not only in uh, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, but also in Indonesia. There's still a couple of Uyghur jihadis that was arrested by Indonesian authority. They're still in jail right now in Indonesia because China tried to lock down its border to prevent them from leaving to go to Syria. In March 1st, 2014, a bunch of Uyghurs who would not be able to leave China, they decide to carry out attack at the Kunming train station. So they went to the train station and carry out the knife attack. Again, I think over 20 people were killed. Eight Uyghur men and one woman. I think they just went into the crowd and slashing people with knives. All the security crackdown that's happening to Xinjiang was a response to this series of terrorist incident. And what they did was this is where get to the more controversial part, though. But people's so-called re-education centers, what they are really de-radicalization centers. So China realized there's a huge problem, a huge terrorism problem in Xinjiang. So they try to construct all these de-radicalization centers in Xinjiang. But the idea is always to have the people to reintegrate these people back to society, and they do it through education and also to train them for a job once they leave, once they are able to reintegrate back to the society is through job training. And this is what the Western media calls concentration camps, essentially. And by the way, most of these centers were closed by July 2019. But of course, none of the Western media bought it, so they still report as if there's some mass concentration camp program still going on in Xinjiang, which is not true. Most of the people who have been sent to the de-radicalization center in 2017, 2018, they have been released and reintegrated back into society because all the centers has been closed in 2019. Then the United States government follow up by saying the people who are getting job training and came out receiving jobs, they're basically being coerced into a government work program. Then they call this like forced Uyghur slave labor. And this is where they became justification for U.S. sanctions on many Chinese companies, including Chinese solar companies, because a lot of the polysilicon that was being produced for solar panels was done in Xinjiang. And And so US is claiming that these solar panels are being produced by Uyghur slave labor. So this is why US got to sanction Chinese solar products. I did like a drawn out explanation. I hope that satisfy your inquiry, or if you have any questions, please ask.
That is amazing. Thank you very much for that. And the reason that I say that is because this is such an interesting topic, this idea that we are being told in the West. And I really struggled with this because my position on this is such an unpopular position amongst our own audience, amongst many people in the United Kingdom. But there's a complete lack of understanding of the fact that radical Islam is a project of the British in the United States. And you talked about what's happened in Afghanistan as starting this whole situation, right? And how the Uyghur populations have been radicalized by the CIA in Afghanistan. But even if we go back before that, the British radicalizing in Saudi Arabia, producing Wahhabism, extreme Wahhabism, radicalizing in Egypt, producing extreme Muslim Brotherhood, all being used for various geopolitical purposes around the world. And then when that same radicalization comes back to the United Kingdom, we've got to blame the entire Muslim population and not recognize that the reason that the radicalization happened was because of operations by the British deep state and the United States deep state, and the impact of that on geopolitics in the world for the last 50, 60 years has been, in fact, going right back to the end of the Ottoman Empire, has been absolutely immense. And this is something that people really need to understand. So I hope what you've just said goes some way to helping people understand that issue.
I just want to add to that. I mean, I spoke about the radicalization program in China. What's the radicalization program in UK? I mean, that's basically turning a blind eye and have these jihadists leave UK and go to Syria to join ISIS. I mean, it turns out most of these people who did carry out terrorist attacks in Europe, they have always, later we find out all of them are on some kind of watch list. All of them have been monitored all this days by intelligence services. Yet these intelligence services somehow willfully turn a blind eye, have these people go to Iraq and Syria to join ISIS, and then sometimes you have them come back, and sometimes they come back and commit terrorist attack, and then they find out, oh, they have, these guys have been being watched by the authority for years, and yet this happens. I mean, like, this is a radicalization program in UK. In reality, they just hoping these people go abroad, go do terrorism in Iraq and Syria, and to harm the people over there.
We've been talking about this for a long time. British, United States foreign aid money going to pay for the weapons and the running of these operations in foreign countries. So we are about 10 minutes from the end here. What I'd like to just finish off with is, obviously, there is a new president in the United States. The last time we spoke, we were talking about the Taiwan situation, and you were saying, for example, that the Chinese are putting huge amounts of money into the coastal towns and cities along the Taiwan Strait, and it didn't seem likely that they were going to be doing that if there was an intention to carry out some kind of operation on Taiwan itself. Trump has now become president, and one of the first things that he has done is to change the wording on the White House website with respect to Taiwan, with respect to the One China policy. And so I wanted to get some feedback from you on the Chinese are viewing that and how they're viewing Trump and the potential for future Chinese-US relations.
As I mentioned last time, Trump has a lot of priorities. I mean, right now, Trump is slapping tariffs on countries left and right, including like Canada, Mexico, and Europe. And of all places, Trump is also threatening tariffs against Taiwan Semiconductors. The one company that produced 90% of the world's advanced chips also happened to be the pillar of Taiwan's economy. And Trump is threatening them with tariffs unless they transfer technology to America to produce chips in America. And right now, Intel, for example, is in deep trouble. And one of the proposals from the Trump administration is to have a joint venture between TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductors, and Intel, and essentially forcing the Taiwan Semiconductor to technological transfer to Intel and to help Intel survive. if Trump was really caring about Taiwan, of course, this would not happen. And what people in China is doing right now is watching the antics of Trump administration with great amusement. Like they would not have dreamed that the government of United States will slap sanction against like the flagship Taiwan Semiconductors. And so yes, there are many in the Trump administration are geared toward confrontation to China. One of the stated aim for Trump to make up with Russia to draw down the Ukraine conflict is so they can concentrate the resources back toward Asia Pacific for confrontation with China. But it just so happens that at this present time, Trump administration has its plate full. First they need to get Greenland from Denmark. They need to annex Canada. They need to invade Mexico and reoccupy Panama Canal. So I think Taiwan is right now is on the back burner, and I don't sense any urgency among the Chinese public. I mean, they in fact they look at the ongoing joke on Chinese internet is that Trump is actually secretly Chinese spy who is said to who is said to make China great again. That's a joke.
So there's no concern at this point. But in the meantime, that might be the position amongst Chinese people. But what's the Chinese government doing? I take it they are preparing for any eventuality, actually.
Well, I mean, one thing they have done is they have been decoupling from United States because U.S. have been threatened to decouple from China all this time. So China is now decoupling from U.S. Now, if you look at the export figures, the percentage of GDP in terms of Chinese export to United States has been declining. Whereas the Chinese export to the rest of the world is growing, especially among to the global South countries, where Chinese products face less tariffs and sanctions. So China is preparing for the tariffs. They have so much more prepared for the American tariffs than, say, European countries or Canada or Mexico, who had never saw this coming. And so China will be fine. And at the same time, China continue to invest in its military modernization. Recently, China just sent its warship to in between Australia and New Zealand. And this is of course response to Australia sending its own spy plane to South China Sea for the last 20 years. Now, the South Australian media is in uproar because they never expect the Chinese will come to them. It's usually they fly warplanes close to the Chinese coast. But what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And this is a time when Trump looks like he's increasingly likely to abandon the traditional alliance that U.S. has with Europe and even with Australia and Canada. So um, interesting times lays ahead, Mike.
Indeed. Now, you did mention Panama, and of course, Trump made a very big deal in his early first few days of Panama being effectively in control of the Chinese, that the United States didn't give the canal back to Panama for them to just give it to the Chinese. But there does seem to have been some movement, and Panama attempting to put some ground between it and Chinese influence of the canal. So, what are the Chinese thoughts about that?
Right. I mean, this so-called Chinese takeover of Panama, has been overblown. I mean, basically, back in 1998, a Hong Kong billionaire Li Ka-shing's shipping service, Hutchinson Whampoa, bought a operating rights of one of the Panamanian port, and ever since, a lot of the right-wing U.S. Circles have been talking about a Chinese takeover of Panama. So Hutchinson Whampoa, they proceeded to expand their operation in Panama. I think now they operate 3 ports. But just because Li Ka-shing is from Hong Kong, so they say, okay, yeah, the CCP, the Communist Party of China, has control over it, which is completely ridiculous. You are right, but Panama actually has been distancing itself from China way before that. After the election of the previous Panamanian president, at that time he canned a lot of the Belt and Road project in Panama. For example, he canned the whole $4 billion investment into the high speed rail project in Panama. So right now, there's no big Chinese investment in Panama. There's only one the ongoing project where China is building a bridge, and that project will probably continue because they're already halfway finished. But there's no new build and road initiative project going on in Panama. So for Panama to say we are quitting BRI, it's just more a PR stunt. They're saying that to give Trump a PR victory, say, okay, see, Panama is doing what the US wanted. In effect, nothing has changed in the ground because there's no major Chinese project going on at this moment.
We will leave it there for today. I'm going to say that has been another hugely interesting conversation, Carl, and thank you very much for that. Let's do this again in the not too distant future because this is such a huge topic and it does need more discussion. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Mike.
For